me. I'm Jayne Christian. I'm a Baramadagal woman, and this is being filmed on Wiradjuri country. So I'm from the Reed-Gold-Spink family line, which belongs in Baramada, now known as Parramatta, and my family has close kinship connection here to Wiradjuri country and on Wiradjuri country. I guess for me, I've been weaving for over a decade now. My mum's been weaving for longer, as have a lot of the aunts here in Wagga that I regularly weave with. And, you know, for us, the practice of weaving, it's a cultural practice, but it's not one that was passed down through our line. And that's, you know, that's a consequence of colonisation and what happened to a lot of the family lines across what's now known as Australia, but particularly in the Sydney area. I'm fortunate that the knowledge of weaving still found its way to me here in the Wiradjuri community, and you know, that's thanks to other Aboriginal groups. I always acknowledge the Nunanjeri people who played a big part in the revival movement of weaving and getting it established back in other Aboriginal communities. And you know, I've benefited from their work of doing that. And so I learnt to weave here in Wagga with the aunts a long time ago and have never stopped. And it's something that I now get to do back on country, around Dharug country in Sydney, and do it with, you know, other Dharug family lines, my own, and also with the broader community, and really use it as a vehicle for having conversations and sharing histories and stories that not everyone knows about. I had seen online that Powerhouse was partnering with the Cité International des Arts to offer the inaugural Galang Residency placements. And I had a look at it and thought, oh, that looks interesting, I wonder who would put in for that. And didn't think any more of it. And then somebody reached out to me and said, you know, I saw this and a few of my favourite Aboriginal artists come to mind and I thought of you. And that's where I kind of had a giggle and thought, oh, I'm not an artist, I just, you know, weave when I'm with my community, but that's where that person had seen me. And so I had another look at it, and what I liked about it was that it was pitched at, you know, First Nations artists or cultural practitioners, and that just left it open, I guess, that you didn't have to have a firm identity as an artist, and it could be open to whatever you culturally do or has cultural meaning and connection for you. And so when I, you know, probably dropped some of my preconceptions about it and read it again, I thought, oh, that would actually be good to do. Like, maybe I could do something. And so I just let it sit, and then one afternoon I was out on a walk, and I think just having a still mind, I got the idea come through that I should apply for it, and a real kind of clear concept of what I could do there. I had finished my law degree and I had done some travel, and so it was before I was starting as a lawyer, and I was here in Wagga and just kind of working out my direction, and I really didn't have anything else to do, and so these weavers got me weaving. And at first I was very impatient and I thought it was too hard and it wasn't for me, and I don't know what I'm doing and I can't remember how to start anything and all those things that people say. But luckily I think it really was that I was here and the aunts were here and I wasn't doing anything else, so I just persevered at it and ended up really liking it and finding that it was a process that really tamed me as well. And so for me, it's something that, you know, I started back then and just wasn't looking at it as anything other than what you do when you're home with the aunts, that type of thing, and wasn't looking at it from a business sense or, you know, as a career. I was starting another career, so that's what it was for me. It was just what you do when you're with community. And we did in the early days, you know, the same way that it was taught here in Wagga. went to other communities and kind of helped with that skills exchange and how you would get a group going. And so we became part of that movement as well. But it was all very organic and grassroots, and yeah, and then over that time it was really just something that I always did in the background of life, but it wasn't foregrounded. I just, it was part of who I was on the weekends. So then I guess I was living in Sydney as well for a few years, which was good, being a Dharug person, to be back and be able to be involved in more community things happening on country. So because I could weave, that was something I could offer in those spaces. And Uncle Greg Sims, of course, his dreaming is the wood carving, and he would always encourage me to be in spaces with him, to tell our stories together and each have something that we do with our hands that we could offer. So when I did my application for the Galang Residency, I had thought that it would be good to weave an exhibition and to start that in Paris, learning more about, I think, at the time when I wrote the application, I was saying the French Revolution, and even myself, I was thinking of the revolution as, an event or a series of events, but historical events, and of course it's not. It's a spirit, and it's a movement, and it's a momentum, and it's embodied by people today in all sorts of ways. And yes, there are the historical events that are the peaks and heights of revolution that everyone has a understanding of, but I was aware that I had a basic understanding of the French experience of revolution, and so I thought being there would just be a good opportunity for me to learn about society there, both historically and how that has carried through to what it is in the modern day, and have an experience of that. And at the same time to be reflecting on First Nations experience in Australia of revolution and ongoing resistance efforts. And then I guess I was keeping it broad just to be open to being guided and not dictating what the experience would be, because that's one thing that weaving teaches you, is just to be open to what can be made through you. And I had just thought, just be open to thinking about what the commonalities are. What are the stories that we can tell that really, honour certain aspects of revolution and shared experience of it. And so that's the kind of thinking that I was in when I applied. So I think the first piece that I wove for the exhibition is the ceasefire, don't forgive, don't forget stop sign. And that came about because when I was flying out to France, it was when the tensions and revolts were happening because of the murder of a 17-year-old French Algerian boy named Nahel. And there were a lot of revolts happening from the people in France to protest the police brutality and the targeting of that faction of the community. And that was something that I wasn't aware. I was aware of, obviously from the news that something was happening, but in terms of that being a systemic issue in France, I wasn't aware of that. But of course I'm aware of how that same trajectory plays out for First Nations people in Australia. And so it wasn't hard for me to understand why people were angry and why that was happening. And that became the first piece I wove, and I was thinking of the Yendamu community and the elders there who called for a ceasefire, which is it's a legal term in international law when Indigenous people call for a ceasefire. And where Nahel was killed by the police, he was shot at a traffic stop compliance check. So just that idea of stop and cease. I wanted to make a piece that joined those two narratives together and shared experience, because naming that what it is and resisting that manifestation of settler colonialism is a form of modern day resistance. And so that became the first piece, just from reflecting on where I was going and what was happening and how that made me feel about things back home. I didn't plan that. And they're the types of things, I think, throughout it that you're just processing the world as you are. And that's how a lot of this has come about. So I guess part of the residency that ended up being quite significant was the connections that lined up for me to see weaving that has, been taken from country and is overseas in the collections in the UK and in France. And there's a lot of weaving there that's from the Sydney area, but also lots of First Nations communities. And just spending time with that weaving, it's like the closest thing that you get to sit with the old ones. They're not there to show you, but you can see what they've done. And you can see that it's the same. It's kind of like you can see what they've done and you know how they've done it because it's how we do it now. And that was really, I felt very close to the practice and to home being with those pieces over there. And one thing that I had thought when I was there is that if we had this back home and if we had this in our own countries, it wouldn't be so hard to prove to people that, we've always been here, because it speaks for itself and you feel that connection. And being able to see the sketches, the Borden collection, obtaining a colour engraving of an original sketch that I saw in France that really spoke to me, using the French record keeping to be part of our modern day storytelling. They're all layers and to this that I couldn't have planned. They were just connections that lined up and things that felt right. So I think when I talk about resistance, it comes from an understanding of settler colonialism and what that is on a global scale and what that is for First Nations here in what's now known as Australia. And I think to understand settler colonialism is to understand that its core objective is to erase Indigenous peoples of a land that they belong to. And so really resistance is anything that stops that erasure process. And I think that's why in my exhibition, there's, honouring the process and cycle of childbirth and mother and child connection, because, that ongoing act of love and continuance is as powerful to resisting settler colonialism as direct conflict, whether it's, through weapons or words or what it is. And that's why it takes so many forms, and it speaks to the intention that they're all actions coming from an intention, which is to survive and exist and, not be altered. So I guess I direct a lot of my efforts on nation building and rebuilding. I think at all times, and I think whether you're an Aboriginal person or First Nations person or a non-Indigenous person, you can't not have been colonised or exposed to colonisation to an extent where you may have absorbed it and, the thinking and the ideology of it to some degree. And so for me, nation building is really talking about that decolonisation process, not in terms of putting things back to how they were 200 years ago, but decolonising the way we think and understand the world and decentering the whiteness from that process. Because a colonial worldview is a worldview and it's one worldview, but it's not the only worldview. And I think when you go, are invested in this process of nation building, it really puts you in touch with cultural values and foregrounding those values and reclaiming things that have been denied and oppressed within communities and family lines. And so, the weaving is important. It's a skill that brings people together. what I do like about weaving, and I'm weaving here with some raffia grass, which the raffia is imported, but my mum has bush dyed that, and we do weave with native grasses as well. My go-to is lamandra, but even in the exhibition there's other native grasses that have been used as well, and it's always linking you back into country. And so even if it's, you know, the natural dye that's on an imported grass or the grass that's from country, and the people that you're weaving with, it's all layers to that process. The conversations that you have is a layer to that process. I think the weaving itself, I always say that it's a meditative activity because your mind is coming back to one repetitive action, and that's when I think you know, we can be used by the old ones because it puts you in that receptive zone to being able to hear that instinctual guidance that we receive. And so I think in terms of nation building, it's important to be connected to the cultural values, to the guidance. We are connected to country, and we're connected to everyone who's ever been before us. And that doesn't stop with colonisation, and it might be fractured, and you know, there might be trauma there that's being processed, but there's a lot of healing as well. And so it's a way of being constructive in that healing process. I think for me what's really special about this exhibition, and this is the part of it that's come about since I got back, I had so much to, I guess, you know, think about just in terms of going and making a start. And then once I made the start and knew what I had and where I was going, it occurred to me that it was actually really important for me to include people who I love and respect, and that those connections in themselves tell a story about the places that are important to me through the people that are important to me. And you know, the weaving journey for me started in Wagga Wagga, and Auntie Pam Honeysett and Auntie Ev Jolly, they're important women, important aunts, and very good weavers, and they're people who I, you know, still weave with today. And so to be able to do things with them means a lot to me, because you never know, life's short for all of us, and to be able to spend the time together and make something together that's meaningful, that's gold. So I am so grateful for the opportunity to do that, and I have you know, worked with both of them on the weaving side, but it's also, you know, bouncing the ideas and the stories, and it's quite funny, like even with the bureaucratic fish, and I was explaining to Auntie Ev about the red tape through it and what that meant to me. I was real frustrated at the bureaucracy of society, so I wove a fish with red tape through it, and she had you know, weavings as well that was going into that same narrative, and then she showed me hers, and so then, you know, that's why because we really resonated on that narrative at that time, worked on that piece together. And so, you know, sometimes you don't know. With Auntie Pam, I worked on the canoes with her, and it's just kind of one step at a time. You're working things out together, and it's unfolding, and then you see where you're at and you reassess, and everything's got layers of meaning, and it's only when you have the conversations that you realise. And so it's a whole process there, and I just love that I got to do it with you know, people who represent what it is to be elders to me, people who represent country that, you know, is home to me, and to have them included in this is really important. And then also to have so many of my family members involved, that is icing on the cake for me as well, because we're a talented bunch, and it's not until you start thinking about how, you might be able to share the spotlight with your nearest and dearest, that you kind of realise where you can collaborate and bring things together. And so to have so many, Baramadagal people from the Reed Gold-Spink bloodline working together to tell this narrative and stand together in solidarity is really special to have achieved as well. And it was also really special to me at the end of the residency. My mum travelled over to Paris with our dear friend Noddy, and they came and saw some of the weaving that was there both in the UK and in Paris with me. And then Mum has, she's done a lot of the natural dyeing that I've used in this. She's done, some of the support pieces to my bigger pieces with the twining. She's a great twiner, and it's been good to feature some of her special weaving styles and that in this as well. And so I'm lucky to have Mum, and that's reflected all through the exhibition as well. So with my exhibition, Djiriyay Rèvolution, I think in addition to coming and experiencing the beauty of the weaving and the exhibition all put together, and the time that it takes to make these pieces, I'm hoping that people can really reflect on the narrative and the experiences behind them, how they've come about and the stories that they're trying to tell. And I think the important part is having reflection on what your own worldview is in interpreting what you're seeing, because if you can gain that self-awareness about the filters and lens that you're coming to things with, that's part of your process of decolonisation. And that's what I hope for people who make the time to come and see, that it's not just a quick whip around and seeing what's on the wall, but taking that reflection time.